A warm welcome to everyone in the audience today to this, the Hugh Leech Memorial Lecture. Whether you're here at the Royal Geographical Society or you're joining us online, we're delighted that you're with us. It's a great pleasure for the Royal Society for Asian Affairs to welcome our speaker this afternoon, His Royal Highness Prince Turki AlFaisal. We're honoured to host today's event, and I'd like to acknowledge the collaboration and support of the King Faisal Centre for Research and Islamic Studies and of Arabian Publishing. We've many distinguished guests in our audience today. In addition to the many members of the Prince's family who are with us, I would also like to acknowledge former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who I believe is joining us online, and former UK Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, who's here at the Royal Geographical Society. Welcome. In 1906, Lord Curzon, the Royal Society for Asian Affairs founding president, remarked that if the Society exists and is meeting in 50 or 100 years' time, Afghanistan will be as vital and important a question as it is now. That was prescient, because more talks about Afghanistan have been given at the RSAA over its 100+ years than about any other country. When we first discussed with the King Faisal Centre the idea of a joint event here in London around the launch of Prince Turki's book, it was always clear that this would be an occasion that would attract attention. Events have since made it all the more topical, and sadly not in a positive way. But that is perhaps all the more reason to pay attention to the period that led up to the Taliban's previous seizure of power. And there are few people as well qualified to talk about that period as His Royal Highness. Before we commence, though, I should like to say a brief word about Hugh Leech, in whose memory this annual lecture is given. Hugh was a British soldier and diplomat who served between the Nile and Euphrates for over 25 years, and who wrote about and travelled extensively in the Gulf states, Central Asia, and Afghanistan. So the combination of Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia through Prince Turki's talk today is particularly well suited to Hugh's memory. Hugh was devoted to the RSAA, leaving the Society a legacy that will help to ensure that it continues to flourish more than a century after its founding. And I'm pleased to say that a book of memories about him will be published later this year by Arabian Publishing, who are also the publishers of the Prince's book. Your Royal Highness, once again, on behalf of myself and our members, our warmest welcome, and I'd like to invite you to the stage.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. Ryder, for arranging this occasion. My thanks also go to the staff of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs for making the occasion happen. Without the dedicated contribution of my co-author, Mr. Michael Field, this book would not be. He rendered whatever I told him in the most precise manner, and he did all the legwork that resulted in what I hope is a valuable contribution to history and knowledge. I know that whoever reads the book will appreciate the literary beauty of Mr. Field's English as much as I did. Your Royal Highnesses, ladies and gentlemen, I knew Hugh Leech when he used to visit the kingdom to share and exchange views on the world with my late uncle, Kamal Adham, God rest their souls. I was just beginning my career in the intelligence business and benefited from both their experiences. It is a privilege to launch this book under his name. Thank you, my captive audience, for coming today. Mr. Field and I finished writing the book soon after I left the embassy in London, and it remained on my desktop until 2019, when the 40th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan occurred. I reread it then and decided to update it, and fortunately for me, Mr. Field agreed to continue what he helped me to start. Again, he took to the field, no pun intended, and the result is before you today. Several publishers declined the book, and I am much indebted to Mr. Peter Harrigan of Arabian Publishing for taking the risk. Arabia is an ancient land. According to the Holy Quran, it is where God built his first house on earth, in Mecca. Throughout its history, for thousands of years, it produced people who migrated from it because of its arid climate to more lush and fertile lands: Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, and further afield. Since my birth, but not because of it, that migratory trend has been reversed. Arabia has become the land where people from all over the world come to make a living and help continue the human development that is taking place there. It is estimated that Saudi Arabia's population in 1945, my year of birth, was 3.04 million inhabitants. Today, it is more than 35 million inhabitants. Over 11 million of them are non-Saudis. Some maintain that the main reason for that is our oil resources. I maintain that in addition to the oil, the kingdom has provided stability and security to allow for the income from the oil bounty to be wisely invested in development. We recognize that we have still to improve our situation, whether it is on issues of human rights or the general well-being of our people. We look around the world and accept that there are lessons to be learned from the experience of others. We have done that in the past. Look at our constitutional progression from the Basic Law promulgated in 1926 to the Basic Law revised in 1993, which defined the country more precisely than the previous one, and which separated the authorities of the king from the Majlis al-Shura and separated both from the judiciary. The line of succession to the king was defined. Since then, the Succession Council, misnamed as the Allegiance Council by so many called experts, was added by the late King Abdullah. It is composed of the living sons of the late King Abdulaziz and the designated heir of each of the late king's deceased sons. It decides by majority vote who succeeds the king. It can also refuse the nomination by the king of his successor. Please look up its details on its website. Women's rights to participate in elections as voters and candidates were added, as well as their right to be guardians of themselves and not beholden to their male relatives. Women were also appointed to the Shura Council and to ministerial and ambassadorial positions. Women today outnumber men as university graduates, and they work where their skills take them without prejudice in salaries. Today, with King Salman's leadership and Crown Prince Mohammed's stewardship, Vision 2030 has launched the kingdom to less dependence on oil and more engagement from our main and essential resource, our people. The vision set up KPIs for government departments and ministers report to the public during the budget year, live on television on what they accomplish. They are grilled by reporters on their presentations. Tourism has been opened, and you can get a visa online, so please don't hesitate to apply. The Crown Prince set out how the Sharia, Islamic law, is interpreted in our courts. To uphold what is set down in the Quran and the verifiable sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This removes any chaff that may have accrued over the centuries to the judicial system and opens the door to modern-day views on human interaction. The kingdom is to become a hub not only for travelers, but also the regional center for international corporations and industries. It is an ambitious view, that includes the kingdom becoming the source for the world's clean energy needs, from hydrogen to solar and wind, but also to cleaner, through research, fossil fuels. It is ironic that while Mr. Biden has set a deadline for eliminating fossil fuels as an energy source, now he is asking us to produce more oil to bring down its price to please his citizens. My distinguished audience, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is sailing through turbulent waters, with thunder and lightning and huge waves crashing into it from all sides. Terrorism is a plague that afflicts the whole world, and Saudi Arabia has been one of its main targets since before September 11, 2001. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all the leftist Palestinian terrorist groups attacked the kingdom wherever and whenever they could. Examples are the attacks on Paris and Khartoum, our embassies there, and the inevitable loss of innocent life. Our oil minister was abducted by the infamous Carlos, the Jackal. Subsequently, in the 90s, Al-Qaeda's first victim was Saudi Arabia, and we continued to be terrorized by them even after September 11th. Fahish, the more proper name for Daesh, because it means obscene in Arabic, continues to threaten us. Thanks to the adroit way the kingdom has dealt with both of their threats have been eliminated. It took a holistic approach to combat them with intelligence, police work, citizens' vigilance, media coverage, education reform, reform of religious speech, and coordination with friendly countries. To the south, we have the festering civil war in the Yemen, with a rebellion begun by the Houthis against the legitimate government and aided by Iran with experts and supplies of ballistic missiles and drones, which they launch against civilian targets in Yemen and in the kingdom. The United Nations Security Council issued Resolution 2216, which condemned the rebellion and imposed an embargo on supplying weapons to the Houthis. Alas, while Iran has continued to escalate her supplies to the Houthis, the world watches and does nothing. Saudi Arabia did not start the war. The kingdom supported and continues to support all the efforts to bring a negotiated peace to Yemen. It has proposed a peace plan which is supported by all the world community except for Iran and the Houthis. The hope is that the new UN envoy can push the Houthis to the negotiating table. When Mr. Biden lifted them out of the terrorist list, they were emboldened and attacked Marib, a town east of Sana'a and held by the legitimate government, and launched more missiles at civilian targets in the kingdom. To the north, Saudi Arabia must contend with tragic human suffering in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Israel, the last colonial power in the Middle East, continues its colonial policy of aggression against the Palestinian people by imprisoning them without judicial recourse, by stealing their land, by forcibly evicting them from their homes, by demolishing their houses, and by assassinating them at will. All of this while the UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338, which all countries support, and set the principle of land for peace between Israel and the countries whose lands it occupies, remain unimplemented. Thanks to Israeli intransigence and America's support for that intransigence. The Arab Peace Initiative, proposed by the late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia nearly 20 years ago, remains on the table. The whole world supports it. Israel continues to ignore it. The common delineator in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, which continues to keep them in turmoil, is the Iranian malign militias that obey Iranian diktat. Alas, Iran has nationals of those countries to do that. In Lebanon, it is Hezbollah. In Syria, it is the murderous Bashar and various Shia militias imported by Iran from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, but also in Syria by Russia, which claims to be fighting the terrorists while it supports the biggest terrorist of all in Syria, Bashar. In Iraq, it is the Hashd al-Shabi and their minions in the Iraqi parliament and government structure. Iran's extraterritorial ambitions are set out in Khomeini's Wilayat-e-Faqih, which stipulates that the world must bow to the rule of the absent imam, an apocalyptic interpretation of Shia doctrine, which is considered heretical by prominent Shia clerics. Since Khomeini's occupation of the American embassy, Iran has declared its enmity to the United States. And yet, we see the United States cozying up to their sworn enemy while distancing themselves from their proven friends. West of the kingdom, in 2018, King Salman convinced Ethiopia and Eritrea to patch up their differences, as well as Eritrea and Djibouti. However, Somalia and Ethiopia suffer from internal strife, which spills into their neighbors' territory. The kingdom continues to face the illegal migration from these countries, which taxes its resources and poses grave security and smuggling problems. Eastwards, I have referred to Iran's hegemonistic ambitions, but in Iran itself, Arab, Kurdish, Baluchi, and Azerbaijani minorities face persecution and oppression. I dare say that even the Farsi plurality are oppressed, as we have witnessed in the murderous way that the regime has dealt with popular dissent. Further east lies Afghanistan, the country that presently prominently occupies the news cycle. Afghanistan was one of the first countries to recognize the Kingdom of the Hijaz and the Sultanate of Najd and its dependencies when the late King Abdulaziz unified them in 1925, before Saudi Arabia became Saudi Arabia in 1932. The late King Mohammed Zahir Shah was the second head of state to visit Saudi Arabia in 1948. The late King Farouk was the first to visit in 1945. The late King Faisal visited Afghanistan in 1970. And the late Dawood Khan, who overthrew Muhammad Shah, visited the kingdom in 1977. There was always a kinship with the Afghan people, and hence the alarm and dismay felt by the Saudi leadership and people when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The rest, as they say, is history. And you must read my book to follow my story. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Your Royal Highness, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you again for honouring us with your presence here today. It is marvellous to be able to host this event. Could I just start, please, by saying, first of all, those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions of either Prince Turki or Michael Field, welcome to you also, please attract my attention in the traditional way by sort of waving at me. But please bear in mind the lights are in my eyes, so it may take me a moment to see you. And for those many who are following this event online, please use the question and answer box in your Zoom windows, and we will be monitoring that, and we'll endeavour to integrate questions from both of those sources. If I may, I would like just to start with a question of my own. Prince Turki, you make a fascinating judgment fairly early in your book that governments, and you're referring particularly, I think, to the Middle East in this, but it's universally true, I think, have to be careful not to get too far ahead of their own citizens in social policies and other matters. And the question occurs to me, I think there's perhaps little risk of the Taliban being ahead of their own population on those things. But knowing them as you do, knowing in particular some of the actors who are still there, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Haqqani, is there a risk that the present Taliban leadership could find itself too far ahead of some of its own leading members?
When I knew the Taliban, they were very much if I can put it this way, a tribal grouping, very much cult-like in their organization, giving full loyalty and service to their leader at the time, the late Mullah Omar, and mostly composed of Pashtuns, the tribal plurality in Afghanistan. Over the years, since then, they have sort of expanded their makeup to include other tribal representatives from different compositions of Afghan society. But their ideology has remained consistent. They come from what is called the so-called Deobandi school of Hanafi sect in Sunni Islam. Those of you who don't know this, Deobandi school was started in India during the British Raj, and it was in response to the British colonialism of the time that this school was established, not only to maintain what was, from their interpretation, very strict Islamic rules and Sharia, but also to provide an alternative, if you like, to the then prevalent British mandated education system in India. And this Deobandi interpretation of Islam is what the Taliban follow, and they do that very strictly, including not just the issue of women, but also issues of a Sufi-like, I won't call worship, but reverence for graves and saints and other such things that contradict, if I may say so, the so-called Wahhabi interpretation of Islamic Sharia. And those are not just the only differences between the so-called Wahhabis and the Deobandi school of Hanafi interpretation. Another difference is in the Deobandi school, a pan-Islamic identity is emphasized with adherence to the top imam, if you like, or leader for the Islamic community, where in the so-called Wahhabi school, the leader of a community can be given the bay'ah, the line of succession, without having a pan-Islamic interpretation to his authority, as is done in Saudi Arabia, for example. So these are two very principal differences between what is called the Wahhabi school and the Deobandi school. And I refer to that because there are many references, whether in the media or in even scholarly books, that try or that claim that there is this Wahhabi influence on the Taliban, which is not the case in my view. But their adherence to this school, I think, remains to this day. They have made some statements since they took over in Kabul recently about forming an inclusive government, about women continuing to study and work and so on. But as the days go on, and I don't know how verifiable these news are, we see examples where outside of Kabul, in the countryside, there seemed to be a different implementation referring back to the previous Taliban government rather than the statements that are made by their spokesman from Kabul, whether it is on girls' education or enforcement of very strict Sharia regulations according to the Deobandi interpretation, et cetera, et cetera. In conclusion, if I may say, I want to wait and see whether the Taliban, how do you say it in English? Yani not put their feet where their mouth is. Put their money where their mouth is, because they've said a lot of things, but we haven't seen them yet implemented.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to give the microphone to Jack Straw, if I may. Could I take the opportunity also to say that there is a microphone on the stand here in the in the stalls here and another one in the balcony. So if those microphones are nearer to you than this one here, when you're given the floor, over there, please go to the microphone.
Thank you very much. Your Royal Highness, thank you very much indeed for your presentation, and I look forward to reading your book too. My question really follows from that which you've just answered, the previous question, which is what approach should the United States, the United Kingdom government and other Western governments take in respect of Iran, of Afghanistan, given what has now happened? I mean, should we just stand back and wait to see, particularly what they do on these key issues of treatment of women, human rights and so on? Are there levers which we could use better to influence them? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. Yes, indeed. I think the world community should keep them to their public statements and not give in to what some commentators are now saying, that we should deal with them and not leave them to their own devices. Two things that I've heard in public, not only from the world community at large, but more particularly from the countries that I think have the most influence on the Taliban. These are Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China. For different reasons, they have a lot of influence on the Taliban, and they remain in Kabul, their embassies and their ambassadors and their representatives. And all of them have said that we want to see the Taliban apply what they said they will do, not only, as you said, Mr. Straw, in terms of women's rights, but also human rights in general, and other activities that they said, inclusion of all parties in a government, that women can work, education for everybody, et cetera, et cetera. I think in terms of humanitarian assistance, that should not be curtailed. I've seen in the news already that the United Nations has begun some form of humanitarian assistance for the Afghan people. This, I think, should continue, and the world community should pitch in. And that, I think, is something that, unfortunately, in the previous example of what I witnessed in Afghanistan, when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, the world community turned its back to Afghanistan completely. not just politically, but also in terms of humanitarian issues and so on. That, I think, would be wrong. The Taliban have to prove themselves, not the other way around. So that is my humble opinion on that question, Mr. Straw.
Thank you. I have a number of people in the room asking for the floor, but if I may, I'm just going to take a couple of questions that are coming in online first. And there are two that are quite closely related, so I will put them together, if I may. Amidou Sani, the Vice-Chancellor of Fountain University in Nigeria, asks, shouldn't the international community encourage good governance in Afghanistan by inclusive engagement rather than coercion and demonstration that democracy in Islamic paradigms is possible? And related tangentially to that is a more direct question. Now that the Taliban have taken control of Afghanistan, what will be the role of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia going forward?
To go to Saudi Arabia with the Taliban?
Indeed, yes.
Well, I'll answer that first. The kingdom broke its relationship with the Taliban because of its relationship with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. I was instructed by the late King Fahd and then Crown Prince Abdullah to go to Mullah Omar to try to get him to hand over bin Laden because he was doing so many terrorist activities in the kingdom at that time. And the Taliban had assured us when they inherited him, well, after they took over in Afghanistan in those days, that they will not let him do any harm to Saudi Arabia. But he continued to do harm to Saudi Arabia. So I went, I remember in June of 1998 to Kandahar, and with me was the then director of the Pakistani military intelligence, ISI, General Naseem Rana, and a Saudi distinguished Minister of Religious Affairs, Dr. Abdullah Turki, to try to convince Mullah Omar to hand over bin Laden to the kingdom. And we were met by him and members of his shura, by Mullah Omar and members of his shura in Kandahar. And after discussing these issues with him, he agreed that we should sit together and find a way how he, having given refuge to bin Laden, can, in an Islamic way, if you like, hand him over to Saudi Arabia. And we agreed to set up a joint committee to do that. And I left Kandahar with those assurances that within the next couple of weeks or so, that there would be this common committee to look at handing over bin Laden. 2 weeks passed and we received an envoy from Mullah Omar who reassured us that they were working on setting up their side of that committee and that they remain committed to handing bin Laden over after that. This was in July after my visit in June. By August, alas, no news from them, and the attacks on the embassies in Africa, Nairobi and Dar es Salaam by Al-Qaeda took place. And Mr. Clinton launched missile attacks on Kandahar and other areas of Afghanistan. And still no word from Mr. Mullah Omar about bin Laden. So in September, I was sent back to Kandahar to try to remind Mullah Omar of his assurances and to ask him to hand over bin Laden, especially now that the attacks in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam had been verified to have been done by Mr. bin Laden. One of his operatives who set up these attacks on the embassies had been arrested in Pakistan on his way back from East Africa and confessed that it was bin Laden who sent him to do these terrorist acts. So the evidence was very much against bin Laden at that time. However, in my meeting with Mr. Omar, he simply denied that he ever made a promise to hand over bin Laden, or even to set up a committee to look into ways of doing that. And after going into a harangue about how Saudi Arabia should be putting its hand in bin Laden's hand as a worthy mujahid, etc., and instead of fighting bin Laden, we should be fighting the imperialists in the United States and so on, I simply stood up and said, Mr. Omar, what you're saying and what you're doing is going to bring harm to you and to Afghanistan, and left. And on the way back, of course, to the kingdom, I sent a report to the king and the crown prince advising that we break relations with the Taliban, which did happen. So their link to the Al-Qaeda has remained. And when Mr. Karzai was still president in Afghanistan a few years back, he asked the kingdom to mediate with the Taliban. So a Taliban delegation came to the kingdom, and King Abdullah, the late King Abdullah, asked them, have you broken with bin Laden? This was before the death of bin Laden. And their answer was no. So he told them, well, we're not going to have anything to do with you until you break your link with the Taliban. And since then, there has been no connection whatsoever between Saudi Arabia and the Taliban. Now, the first question was about?
It was, to boil it down, it was, shouldn't the international community engage rather than isolate the Taliban? I can read it in full. Shouldn't the international community encourage good governance in Afghanistan by inclusive engagement rather than coercion, and to demonstrate that democracy in an Islamic paradigm is possible?
Well, I think I answered that in the first answer to Mr. Straw's question. There should be an engagement with the Taliban to make them implement what they said they will implement, which is an inclusive government, rights of women, etc., etc. So yes, that should continue.
Thank you very much. I have a question from the gentleman here. Would you mind going to the microphone?
Your Royal Highness, it's a pleasure to see you again, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
If I may, I would just like to have your opinion on two issues. What has happened in Afghanistan, the evacuation, I think is prominently at the top of one of the worst evacuations we've ever seen in modern history, the retreat. And it has caused a number of allies of the West to feel some suspicion in terms of the support. How do you see the West regaining the moral high ground and support after what we have seen in Afghanistan? You have yourself, in your remarks, mentioned Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I would like to hear from you on that. The second point, if I may, is, quite frankly, Afghanistan is a failed state, and expecting the unexpected, we need them, if they are going to prove that they can be part of the global community, to do something now. I know a number of Afghani intellectuals unable to leave Afghanistan. How long will the world just watch until things may deteriorate? Shouldn't we step up and say people who need to leave should leave now? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jabbar, and thank you for being here.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just before you leave the microphone, if I may, for the benefit of the online audience, would you mind saying who you are so that everybody knows?
My name is Shafiq Gabr, and I'm a citizen of Egypt, but I have the pleasure of knowing His Royal Highness.
Mr. Jabbar also has a wonderful philanthropic organization that gives scholarships to students from Egypt to study around the world, which is a wonderful occasion to have him with us here today. The first question about the West and what it can do to rectify, if I may use that word, if I understand that's what you mean, what was shown to be not so orderly or efficient way of dealing with the evacuation in that took place from Kabul. Well, I'm not in government, so far for me to provide advice to governments on how to do these things. I'm sure in their halls, whether here in Whitehall and other places, or in America and the Congress and the State Department and so on, they have experts who can look at what happened and provide what they might be considered as good advice. However, having said that, and there's always a however in one of these occasions, it is not good that such scenes as we saw take place in Kabul to signify the, if you like, the orderly way that not just the West, but any government acts in a situation like that. So definitely there has to be some way of the United States particularly to look into itself and see how things went wrong and try to fix them. But the allies of the United States as well have a responsibility to provide that advice that you're asking me to provide to our good friends in the United States. The other question, can you remind me what it was?
I was wondering if there is a hope for Taliban to recognize that it wants to become part of the global community, that it needs to act now, especially in relationship to a number of Afghani intellectuals and professionals that want to leave but are unable to leave, which somehow shows empty promises and makes us worried that a failed state will not keep its commitments.
Well, that is a big question, I think, that I've already answered, that we have to see what they do rather than what they say. I've seen in the reports coming out of Afghanistan that some flights have taken place after the first evacuation of people from Afghanistan and other citizens of different countries from Afghanistan leaving. But how that is going to continue or whether it will continue, I really can't tell you, Mr. Gabbard.
Thank you. In a moment, I will give the floor to the gentleman in the centre who was asking a few minutes ago. But could I first just take a question online? Professor Peter Frankopan, who is the president of this society, is unfortunately not able to be here in person, but he has asked me to put the following question. Could Your Royal Highness cast your eyes forward to 2030 or 2040? In what ways might the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself and the wider region be different from the way it is today?
That's a tall order. One must believe in principles and ideals in order to try to live up to them in practice, and not simply in vocal iterations of those ideals and principles. The United Nations Security Council and its setup is my generation thought it was going to be the way that the world will go forward. Unfortunately, we have seen that in many cases, like we see today in Afghanistan, that has not happened. So I think the United Nations has to be reformed. And I remember our late foreign minister, my older brother Saud, when he was dealing with this situation, he made a proposal to the United Nations when they were talking about reform under Kofi Annan, if you all remember that time 10, 15 years ago, that the United Nations voting system with veto power was a problem that prevented implementation of Security Council resolutions passed by that Security Council. So he suggested that whatever resolution is passed by the Security Council cannot be vetoed after in the form of implementation. And he gave an example, resolutions 242 and 338 that I mentioned in my presentation on the Middle East. All members of the Security Council and the whole world, including Israel, accepted those two resolutions as a means of achieving peace between Israel and the Arab countries in general, but more specifically, the ones that they occupied land from after the '67 war. But when it came to implement those two resolutions, the veto power intervened. So there was no way that the high principles and ideals expressed in those two resolutions could be implemented. And he thought that it would be best if there would be a way for the Security Council to overcome this way that it itself interrupts its own ideals and principles. I'm sure there are other ideas around for that, about expansion of the Security Council, etc. But alas, I'm not very optimistic on that.
Thanks very much. Your Royal Highness, John Jenkins, the former British ambassador to Saudi Arabia and various other places, mostly in the Middle East. It's lovely to see you in London in person, rather than at the end of a Zoom call. I wanted to follow up the question that Shafiq asked, actually. And it starts with the American withdrawal from Kabul. And it's not just a manner, it's a fact of the withdrawal. And there's been a lot of commentary since then about this representing a hinge in global politics, that we are entering a new age of transactional multilateralism, as it were. And specifically with regard to the kingdom and the wider Gulf region, there's been a lot of speculation about what this means. And people have said this in the context of the Abraham Accords. There was the rather wonderful recent photograph of the Crown Prince with Sheikh Tamim and Sheikh Tahnoun from the Emirates. And people are seeing increasing hedging in the Gulf on the assumption that this represents the withdrawal of the United States as a guarantor, as an offshore guarantor, an offshore balancer from the region, which will change it in a way that it hasn't been changed since 1945. How do you see all that?
Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins, and thank you for being here. When Mr. Obama declared that the US should pivot to the east, he pretty much told us in our part of the world that we have to start thinking of providing for ourselves and not to be so dependent on our friends, particularly the United States. And I remember in his famous interview, I don't remember with which newspaper or journalist, before he left office, I think it was a year before he left office, he practically said that he didn't want people riding on America's back to get whatever they want from their intentions and their aims. Mr. Trump definitely didn't hide his disdain for the rest of the world, and that America was paying too much for protecting not just Europe and Japan and Korea, but also our part of the world. And Mr. Obama has followed suit on that. So yes, countries like Saudi Arabia, fortunately for us, patching up the rift in the Gulf Cooperation Council is a good step forward in that effort to find the wherewithal within our capabilities to come together and to provide whatever we can in our capabilities to help ourselves. But that really, in my view, contradicts the general principle of multilateralism in the world. If you can't turn to people to ask them to help you, you cannot be simply alone in the world community. So I think the Gulf states particularly will continue to seek support from their traditional allies, whether it is the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe in general, or even new friends that have come about, whether it is Russia and China, India perhaps, and other countries like that. Within the Islamic world, of course, there is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which the kingdom has been very much supporting and engaging with these countries. And if you look at the travel plans for our foreign minister in the last 6 months, you will see that he has been flying around and probably acquiring, all sorts of good points on the airlines to get compensation for all of the miles that he has covered. And it is, I think, and I'm interpreting because I don't know, I'm not in government, so I don't know what the reason behind it is. But my interpretation is that the kingdom wants to be fully engaged with the rest of the world in order, in case we need to have friends supporting us when we face certain crises, that those friends will be there for us. It's not good also to see that your closest friends assuring you that they're standing with you, like the United States has done, even under Mr. Biden, in spite of his criticisms of Saudi Arabia. He said that he will continue to provide assistance to the kingdom to defend itself. But at the same time, when Saudi Arabia continues to be bombarded by missiles and drones, and not just from the Yemen, but also from Iran, the United States decides to withdraw Patriot missiles from Saudi Arabia. As an observer, I can say that that is not reassuring about where Mr. Biden's commitment to the kingdom is to defend itself against foreign aggression. So we need to see more of that. As a citizen of Saudi Arabia, I say that. The government is represented here by Prince Khalid bin Bandar, and I'm sure, perhaps not at this session, but in other sessions, he may be grilled on that point more than me. And that is all I can say, Ambassador Jenkins.
Your Royal Highness, it is always a pleasure to see you here and to listen to you, and thank you for the advice which you've provided for me over many years. Much appreciated. And I seek it again. It follows quite closely on Sir John's question in a way. How do you interpret President Biden's appreciation of the forever war? Is he right to say that a forever war can come to an end by his unilateral action? Or is it not the case that there is always a forever war between those citizens who want more open societies and those who would close them down? And if that is a forever war, how in this new context must it be conducted?
Thank you, sir. If I can put it this way, I think there are right wars and wrong wars. Example, the war to liberate Kuwait, in my view, was the most right war ever, that brought the whole world to deny territorial aggression as a principle and to force the aggressor to retreat from that. And it had a very clear aim, which was to get Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. It didn't develop into a further step, which could have happened, but then the leadership, I think, in the countries then, particularly in America, but also in Saudi Arabia and the UK, and in France and in other allies, remained committed to that commitment to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi forces. They didn't go further than that. That, to me, was the perfect example of a right war. The war on terror, however, and if I may say, the war in Afghanistan followed from that. It's not simply Afghanistan, but it's the whole terror issue is a forever war. There will always be terrorists. History is full of them, and we can't deny that it is going to continue. And the more it continues, the more it will splinter and become spread and afflict and inflict more terror on the rest of us. So how do you stop a war like that? I believe that in the case of the war on terror started when bin Laden bombed the Twin Towers in New York, could have been stopped had the United States remained committed to get bin Laden back in 2002 after they invaded Afghanistan, instead of diverting towards Iraq and going in there and doing what it did there. There was another occasion, I think, when the United States could have justifiably said, and there is an end to this war, when they killed bin Laden. Because the main target of that initial response of the United States and the world community, not just the United States, to the attacks on the Twin Towers was to get Al-Qaeda and to get bin Laden. And having succeeded in doing that, I think the United States should have then declared that it is ending the war. And with allies and with the then government in Afghanistan worked on a way to draw down the presence of the forces of the United States and other allies in Afghanistan. So two opportunities, I think, were missed at that time. Now, I really don't know what is going to happen, because the Taliban remain, and they remain allied with Al-Qaeda. And we see that Fahish, as I call it, is present in Afghanistan and trying to take advantage there. Who else they're going to allow to come to Afghanistan and perhaps use them as a means of pressure on the world community, we don't know yet. Still have to wait and see how they deal with that. But this is what I think should have been done some time ago.
Your Highness,
Yes,
this is Iraj Bagherzadeh, and it's very nice to see you in London again.
Thank you.
I am a publisher, but alas, I have not published your book, sadly. My question involves your obvious expertise on Afghanistan. As I understand it, something like 95% of the Taliban are Pashtuns, in that order of magnitude. The Pashtun population of Afghanistan, they make up about 40, 42, 43% of the population. The remainder, the Dari-speaking Tajiks and the Uzbeks and so on and so forth, as I understand it, do not have much of a role to play at all in the workings of the Taliban. How, in your view, do you see the long-term prospects of a Taliban-led government in Afghanistan when they clearly do not represent the majority or even a sizable minority of the country?
It's going to be difficult for them. And this is where we're still waiting to see how they deal with the other composition of Afghan society. You correctly say that the Pashtuns make up a portion of Afghan society, but the others like the Tajiks, or the Uzbeks, the Hazaras, I understand, and this is something that maybe might amuse some of you here. When I was dealing with Afghanistan many years ago, I heard from Afghans that there were still 2 villages, I think in the province of Kunar, and east of Afghanistan, where the people there still spoke ancient Greek from the time of Alexander the Great. Now, I didn't meet any of these people, so I can't verify whether what I heard is right or not. But it just indicates how complicated the composition of Afghanistan is. And like all such tribal compositions, you have to work very hard to get a collective view of what is in the interest of all of the composition and not just one party or the other. This is something I think that the Taliban have to show us that they are sincere about and include, not just in their government, but also in how they deal with the other minorities, whether it is in Mazar-e Sharif or in Jalalabad or in Kandahar or various other places, towns and villages, that they think of these people as fellow citizens and not as Hazaras or Uzbeks or Tajiks or Pashtuns or ancient Greeks in this case. That is something that we have to wait and see, I'm afraid.
I'd just like to add, from my own experience in Afghanistan over a number of years, it fascinated me that despite the bitterness of the civil war in Afghanistan over many years, I never met a single Afghan who favored secession of any part of the country. They would all say, irrespective of their ethnic origin, we are Afghan, which in the circumstances I found remarkable and encouraging. I'm going to pick up a couple of questions online. One of our callers asks...
Okay, I can't hear the questions, that's true. My hearing's very bad,
okay.
So I can't hear a thing really.
Well, we'll translate.
I'd like to say something on my own version.
I'll make sure that we come to you. One of our callers asks, how will the changing role of China affect the Taliban and Afghanistan? It's, of course, a question that we're all thinking about, but they are actually a bordering country for Afghanistan.
China, during the jihad, contrary to their relationship with the Soviet Union at the time, did provide assistance to the Mujahideen in the form of weapons and other such requirements. And since the formation of the government under President Karzai that came out of the American invasion of Afghanistan and the Allied invasion of Afghanistan, have progressively developed relations inside Afghanistan and kept their links, in my view, with the Taliban while they were in opposition to that government and the subsequent government. And we've seen a delegation of the Taliban that has gone to Beijing to meet with Chinese officials. So China will definitely try to take advantage of that situation and provide whatever assistance that they believe will serve expanding their influence in Afghanistan. I read in the papers and see on television reporting and things like that that China is very much interested in the precious metals that are available under the ground in Afghanistan and would like to mine some of those issues. And I think at one time or another, they had an agreement with the previous government to do that. But it has been put on hold probably until they see what the Taliban will do with that proposition. So yes, China will definitely try to expand its influence.
Two questions already from the floor here. Gentleman here on the right, and then the lady to the left. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness, my friends. I'm Hussam Zumlud, the Palestinian ambassador to the UK. You are revered and respected by my generation, by many Arabs, Your Highness, Royal Highness, for your eloquence, your strong support of the Arab issues, your blunt and no mincing of words all over the years. And I myself have learned from your speech today and your long experience. Before I ask very quickly my question, in the interest of diversification of the questions, allow me to say that you have mentioned Israel, Palestine in your speech. And again, the eloquence of capturing it in one paragraph. We are facing this deadlock right now where we have an intransigent Israeli government. You described it as the last colonial project. We have unprecedented steps that would murder any possibility of a two-state solution. We have a different US administration right now in the White House. We lived a difficult period with the Trump administration, but now we have a Biden administration that adopts the long-held US policy. Only yesterday in the General Assembly, President Biden said they full-heartedly support the two-state solution, but they don't think we are near enough to that. Given this dynamic we are in, what is your advice, Your Royal Highness, as far as the Palestinian file? Where do we go? And the ignoring of the Arab Peace Initiative that you took part in, where do you go from now, given the boiling situation on the ground and the possibility of another confrontation only around the corner, because the Palestinian public is very tense, as we have just seen in May, if you remember, during the Jerusalem events, the Sheikh Jarrah event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. There is a very important step that should be taken by our Palestinian brothers, which is to get over this rift between Hamas and Fatah. That prevents any meaningful expectation that a two-state solution can be a viable one. That division, I think, is an important contributor to the fact that Israel has refused to come forward in its negotiations, not just with the Palestinians, but with the rest of us. And to expect that, or to wait for United States pressure on Israel to bring it to the table now under Mr. Biden, I think is self-illusory. Mr. Biden is not going to put pressure on Israel. He made his statement, and he kept the commitment of the United States to the two-state solution, but he's not going to spend any capital, political or otherwise, to bring Mr. Bennett and his cabinet to reach some accommodation with Mr. Abbas or with Hamas in that case. So I'm not very optimistic that we're going to see a solution to the Palestinians, or even the start of a solution, while Mr. Biden is president. And I just don't know what circumstance can bring that about with the present division between Hamas and Fatah in Palestine. Our Egyptian brothers have been forthcoming in trying to overcome this rift between Hamas and Fatah. And good luck to them. But they haven't succeeded so far.
Thank you. I'm very conscious that time is passing, so I'm just going to take two questions, one from in the room and another online, and then we will make sure that there is an opportunity for Michael Field to say a few words as well. Please.
Dr. Agad Al-Harthi, Chatham House. Thank you, Your Royal Highness, for this talk and for this book. Very insightful. My question is, clearly the Taliban of 2021 is not so different from the Taliban of 2001. So on an international level, what can we do to curb recruitment and prevent it? from individuals who have the same ideology? Thank you.
Who?
Recruitment.
The Houthis?
Recruitment.
Recruitment.
Yes, thank you.
I don't know if the international community can do something about that. Did you mean recruitment for terrorists or for the Taliban? For the Taliban. Well, the Taliban have succeeded, as I mentioned in my presentation and in my answers to some of the questions, to expand their embrace outside the Pashtun. We saw that reflected in how easily they took over in Mazar-e-Sharif, for example, and other areas in what would be considered Tajik land in Afghanistan, and even among the Hazaras. So how they deal with them afterwards, but they haven't included any of those in their cabinet, as far as I've read in the press. The cabinet is very much a Pashtun Taliban cabinet. And so I'm sure other compositions of Afghan society will grumble if they're not included in that. And that may diminish the Taliban's ability to maintain whatever links they may have developed over the years with the other tribal compositions of Afghanistan. But it's still too early to tell. So I wish I had a clearer answer for you, but I don't.
Well, I've got one last question before giving Michael Field an opportunity, and it's a question from the online audience, one which I have to say I slightly fear your answer to in light of recent events. But our questioner says, as someone involved in diplomacy for decades, have you seen a decline in the art of diplomacy, or is it in good hands?
I think I might ask that question of Mr. Straw. But, well, I think it's a seesaw issue for diplomacy. I think sometimes it's more proficient and more engaging and more productive. At other times, it tends to fail where it should be expected to succeed. So I'm reminded of a statement by a famous American historian at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. I think his name was Will Durant, if I'm not mistaken, who wrote a history of the world, several volumes. And when he finished the last volume, a reporter asked him, Mr. Durant, what is your take on this history of the world in several volumes that you finished? And his answer was, son, it's one damn thing after another. Yeah, I'm not trying to be flippant or not answer the question, but diplomacy is diplomacy. We saw Mr. Biden say that he is committed to bringing back diplomacy in vogue, as it were. And yet, his withdrawal from Kabul was not very diplomatic. So I don't know where to go from there. Definitely, if I can give an example from our part of the world, diplomacy did succeed in ending the rift between Qatar and the rest of the GCC. And as I mentioned in my presentation, King Salman's diplomacy convinced Ethiopia and Eritrea to patch up a 20-year conflict, which is not bad, as well as Eritrea and Djibouti. So there are some successes there. Other areas, maybe not as successful as that. But I remember my late brother, who was my mentor in foreign affairs, because he was minister for many years, and I was sort of an intrusion on his province of diplomacy when I became ambassador, coming from the intelligence business. He told me, the first thing he told me, he said, "Do you know what the definition of a diplomat is?" And I'm sure Mr. Straw knows this. I said, "No, what is it?" He said, "A diplomat is he who will say yes, or he will say no when he means maybe, or no, he will say yes when he means maybe, and he will say maybe when he means no. But if he says no, then he's no diplomat." So whether present-day diplomats follow that rule, I don't know.
Thank you very much indeed. And now invite Michael Field. It's entirely up to you, but you will need the microphone.
Look, I would like to say a few words off my own back about this book. I've written 6 books over the years, and this is the 6th. With all the others, I felt at the end, oh, maybe I could have done better. Questions come up, I think I should have addressed that issue differently, or said something more on this. And of course, when I've read the reviews, that sentiment's been amplified. But I can honestly say, with this book, which has been going on for a long time, I have no reservations. Now, maybe when I read the reviews, I will start having reservations. But for the time being, I'm happy. And that's not the situation that I felt with the previous books after I finished them. I'd submit them to the publishers and then have doubts. And I can honestly say that when I was researching this book and talking to Prince Turki, there was not a single question that I asked Prince Turki that he dodged, or to which he replied with a diplomatic answer, or an answer that was not complete, or an answer that did not satisfy me in any way at all. Nor did I avoid asking certain questions, as one sometimes does in any conversation, because I felt it would embarrass Prince Turki. I asked everything I wanted to say, and I got completely frank answers. So when people have said to me over the last couple of years, while this book's been in the process of coming out, how frank is it? I've said to them, it's completely honest as far as I can tell. Several times people have said to me, well, look, Saudi Arabia, didn't it support the Taliban? I said, no. And to me, it's obvious that it didn't. I mean, why? Because Saudi Arabia is a status quo power. It doesn't like revolutions. It particularly doesn't like revolutions on the part of organizations that claim to be more Islamic than Saudi Arabia. Even if it had wanted to support the Taliban, it would have probably done it through Pakistan. But anyway, it didn't. Now, I remember when I was doing research for this, I read a book by a well-known author, a very good book on this subject, by a very well-known, well-respected author. And in it, it contained the statement that Saudi Arabia had shipped through Dubai 1,600 pickup trucks to help the Taliban in the early 90s. And I thought, well, this doesn't make sense. As I said, Saudi Arabia would not naturally support that sort of revolutionary organization. If it had wanted to, it would probably have given the money to the Pakistanis who had done the shipment. Because the story of Saudi Arabia's support for the Mujahideen earlier was that it paid and Pakistan arranged the arms supplies. So I said to Prince Turki in one of our conversations, did you, as this author says, supply 1,600 trucks shipped from Dubai to the Taliban? I said, no, of course not. So later, I went to see the author of this book, who I wanted to see about lots of subjects. And I said, look, you made this statement. It doesn't seem plausible to me. And Prince Turki denies it. Well, do you think it could have been the Saudi private sector? Somebody in the private sector who shipped these trucks? Oh, yes, he said. Well, maybe it was the private sector. Well, I said, look, in your book, you said it was the government. It was in particular the intelligence presidency. Oh, well, it could have been the private sector, he said. Now, I tell you this just as an anecdote, but it's somehow symbolic of the way that the press, and I mean the media as a whole, newspapers, radio, television, authors, tend to treat Saudi Arabia. If there's something bad that you can't easily explain, blame it on Saudi Arabia. And of course they do this because Saudi Arabia doesn't often answer back. There are few good, articulate spokesmen for Saudi Arabia who are prepared to say things in public. So the media gets away with this. But I tell this anecdote really just as one small example, one small thing. And getting back to the book itself, but I would say this, wouldn't I? But I can honestly recommend it. I have no reservations. As far as I can see, it's completely accurate and it's completely honest. And that's due to my conversations with Prince Turki, which were completely frank.
To the online audience, I know that there were some problems with the sound feed towards the end, but there will be a recording of this event on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you were unable to hear some of Michael Field's comments, you will be able to hear them online later. With that, I would like to thank you and to hand back over to my chairman, Frank Slevin, to close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Just wrapping up, my thanks on behalf of myself, the audience, the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, to His Royal Highness for his contribution today, not only in his opening remarks, but I think in his very insightful Q&A. And we have a couple of very modest tokens of our appreciation, if we may. The first comes from Peter Frankopan, Professor Peter Frankopan, who unfortunately was unable to join us, and this is an author-to-author. So this is a signed copy of his book on the Silk Roads.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And then a somewhat more substantial gift, if we may. And this is a reproduction of an original drawing by Colonel Gerald de Gorey, which is held in the collection of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. And it is the taking of the Grand Cross of the Bath from George V to Ibn Saud in 1935.
Yes.
Actually, in mind.
Ah, wonderful. Lovely. Mr. de Gorey wrote a wonderful book about Saudi Arabia and King Abdulaziz.
Excellent.
Thank you, sir.
No, thank you.
May I just say that among us in the audience here, before that, this is a small gift of appreciation from the King Faisal Center. It's a reproduction of one of the manuscripts that we have in the center. I think it is Kalila Udimna. Dalail al-Khairat. So please, for your collection here at the Asia Society.
Thank you very much.
And this goes with it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just going to say that in the audience, I have 2 generations of my family who are going to school here in England. 2 in university and 2 still in school. So there are 4 of them. 1 is my youngest daughter, and the others are my grandchildren. The one who is absent, he's going to Winchester School, and they wouldn't let him come to London midweek. So thank you, UK, for hosting us. And thank you at the Royal Society for wonderful, wonderful hosting. And you, audience, have been magnificent. Thank you for being here. Michael, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
No, thank you
Again.
so much. Thank you.